So let's talk about a little bit about what the new DevTools are. So this is a full rewrite of the DevTools, which are currently supporting Vue 3 and also are also going to support Vue 1 and Vue 2 very soon. And it's gonna look a little bit different from the previous versions because I reworked the user interface, and it also features a new way to debug applications, which is the timeline. Maybe we can take a look at the DevTools before we start talking about the plugin API. So here I'm in a Vue 3 application, and I have the new DevTools open here. And as you can see, the toolbar at the top is very different from the previous version. Because it's now scoped on a specific application, which means you can now select different applications on the same page, and the rest of the DevTools will be specific for this selected application. You also have buttons here to go back or forward, depending on where you were on in the DevTools. And you also have access to the changelog here when I publish, new features on bug fixes, release notes. And next to this application selector, you have your main menu here, where you can select between the inspector tab, the timeline tab, the plugins, and the settings. You also have access to the timeline by going into the menu on timeline here. And this is entirely new in the DevTools. And it's basically a different way of looking at what's going on in your application over time. So for example, I can click with my mouse in the application, and it will add new events here and also show a preview of what happened during that time. So you can see that you have a little preview in your page of the mouse events here, and you can select an event to have more information about it, and also the time when it occurred. It also works with keyboard. So for example, if I type here, you can see a stream of keyboard events coming in on the timeline, and you can move between them to inspect them. All right. When I click on the button here, we can see that a component event is coming through, and we can select it and see what the parameter is. And you can also see on the page a preview of where the event is coming from in your application. Okay, so that was a quick tour of the new DevTools. You can install it by going to the Vue DevTools repository. Okay, so the main topic of this talk is an entirely new thing in the DevTools, which is the API, which is kind of a new concept regarding DevTools, I think. And this is gonna basically allow any Vue plugin to integrate with the DevTools. So for example, you can install the Vue 4 version for Vue 3, and it's gonna integrate with the DevTools without the DevTools having to hardcode a specific logic to handle the filter. It's very useful for third-party plugins as well, such as Vue i18n or Vue Apollo, for example. So this is now possible with this API, and currently the API is centered around three different features. The first one is basically adding new informations in the components inspector. The second one is creating entirely new custom inspectors. So for example, Vuejs is adding a custom inspector to display every route in your application and more information about each route. Okay, so the third feature is timeline layers. It's gonna allow plugins to add new layers to the timeline and push new events. This is very useful for plugins such as Vuex, for example, to display operations made by the plugin. And Vuex could push events for example, for commits on actions, and they would be displayed on the timeline, and so that you could debug your application behaviors um, over time. And you will also have more context. You can see that a specific action is dispatched uh, when a specific component event is emitted, and when, for example, the mouse is clicked on a specific button in your application. So it's an entirely new way, of debugging your application, and I think it has a lot of potential. You'll soon be able to read the devtools API documentation if you're interested in integrating your Vue plugin with the devtools. So here I have an application, and I'm gonna use my plugin here, which I call my awesome plugin, and I'm gonna integrate it with my application here with using app.use. And this plugin is basically a package here, which gonna do a very dumb thing, which is currently adding a computed property to every component in my application. But we could imagine, doing things more interesting, but that's for the sake of the demonstration here. And basically, I'm using it here in my application to display this hello message here. Okay, so we're gonna start with the components inspector, and this API allows you to basically add new state to the selected component. For example, Vuejs could add is actually adding the current route in the state inspector, and you can also add more information in the component tree by putting tags on the component nodes. So let's see how it works. Okay, back to our plugin. I can create a new file here. So the idea is to separate the logic specific for the devtools. So that way you don't ship the devtools related code to the final users of the web application. So I'm gonna create a different file here where I'm gonna put every DevTools API code. So I'm gonna, for example, I'm gonna explore a function which I can, for example, call setup DevTools, like here. I'm gonna call this function in my install method of the Vue plugin here, but I want to remove this call when I'm in production mode. So to do that, I can use as specific global variables. So for example, I can say if I can say if the node environment is development, I can add the devtools to my plugin. I can add the devtools related code to my plugin. But in Vue 3, we also provide a variable that allows you to enable the devtools in production as well. So you can also use this variable, which is called viewProd devtools. And here I'm using TypeScript, so it's gonna complain that this variable is not defined. So what you can do here is to create a global type definitions file, and we can declare the const here so that TypeScript is happy again. This variable will be used by the Vue free build tools to allow you to enable the DevTools related code in production. And you can, for example, use this variable in your staging environments where you want to also have access to the DevTools. So here is going to mean that my plugin is going to strip this part out in production unless you specify this variable here. Okay, so now we are ready to use the DevTools API. So we can install a package in our plugin here to help us use this API. So I'm gonna open a terminal in my plugin here. I'm gonna install the Vue DevTools API package. And this package is gonna provide access to the DevTools API on the page. So now I can go back to my DevTools code here, and I can import from the Vue DevTools API package. I'm gonna import the setup DevTools plugin method here. This function allows you to declare a DevTools plugin, which then will grant you access to the DevTools API. So the first thing you want to do here is to call this setup DevTools plugin function. And the first argument is going to be a plugin descriptor where you can put some information about your plugin so that users can know a little bit more about your DevTools plugin. So it's going to be an object, and you have to put an ID here. So I'm going to use my awesome plugin ID, for example, or my awesome DevTools plugin, for example. Then you have to give it a name with the label property. So gonna call it my awesome DevTools plugin or my awesome plugin. And you can also put the name of the package where this DevTools plugin is coming from, so that your user knows, the source of your DevTools plugin. So, for example, I can reuse here my plugin name in the package JSON. So it's gonna be my awesome plugin. And you can also put a link. So for example, I can say https://vue.js.org. And then you also need to give it an application instance. So we're gonna pass the application instance as an argument here. And we're gonna add it here as well. And then we are done with the descriptor. And we can continue with the second argument of setup DevTools plugin, which is a function which grants you access to the DevTools API. So we're gonna create a function with an API object as the parameter. And this API object allows you to integrate with the DevTools. So if I save now, we should be able to go to the plugins tab here and say that in our application, there's a new plugin a DevTools plugin. There's a new DevTools plugin, and you can select it and see more information about this plugin. Here, the user can see that this DevTools plugin is coming from this specific package in his application, and you can also click on the link you provided to, the documentation of your plugin to know about more about it. I recommend using the Vue plugin name here instead of saying my awesome DevTools plugin, because most of the time you are adding a DevTools plugin to display debugging information from your Vue plugin, so it makes sense to use the same name of your. It makes sense to use the same name of the Vue plugin you are building here. Let's see what we can do with the components inspector in our application. So the first thing we could do is to display the computer property we are adding to our components here. So I'm gonna switch back to the components inspector, and I want to display an additional state here in my component. So you can use hooks to listen for specific events going on in the DevTools using the API.on, using API.on, and then you can choose between different kind of hooks. And the one which is interesting here is going to be inspect component. So basically, you can hook into the process of inspecting Vue component in the DevTools. Usually, hooks are gonna pass two parameters to you. The first one is gonna be the payload, and the second one is gonna be a context object, like this. And then you can use those parameters to gather more debugging information to be displayed to the user. So here, the payload is gonna contain the component instance, which is currently inspected, and the instance data, which is gonna be displayed in the state pane here. So what we can do here is to modify the instance data by adding new piece of state here with this state array. And we can say, for example, that we want to create a new section here that I'm gonna call, for example, my awesome plugin state. And then you can give your piece of state a name with the key property. So it's gonna be hello with a dollar. And then you can put the value. So for example, we could pass my reactive state from the plugin here to my DevTools code as an argument. And then I'm gonna retrieve it here, and then I'm gonna use it to display the information in the DevTools here. So that's gonna be data message. And then we have to say that it's not an editable property. All right. So let's try it. So we can see here that we have a new section in our component state. And we can toggle it like any other section. And we can see that we've displayed a new piece of state coming from our Vue plugin here. So a good practice is extracting this state type into a variable. So I'm gonna call it a state type. All right, and then you can also, and then you should declare to the DevTools that you're gonna, provide a new state type in the component inspector by using the component state types property on the plugin descriptor. and it's gonna be an array where you can put the state type, and then we can save, and we can see that the DevTools is now adding this plugin icon here, and this provide the user with more information about where this new state is coming from. So we can see here that the tooltip is displaying the plugin name, and then you can click on it, and it's gonna redirect you to the plugin page in the DevTools, so the user can know more about it. We've done an example of the first feature here, so we can also alter the tree node to add new tags. Visit component tree hook here, and then like the previous one, retrieve the two arguments, so payload and context, and then again get the current tree node from the payload object. So it's going to be payload tree node, and then it can, for example, add a new tag here. So the tag is going to have a label, a text color. So this is going to use a number, so you can no, this is going to be a number, so you can use the JavaScript notation for hexadecimal, which starts with 0x and then an hexadecimal representation of the color. So I'm gonna put black color here, and then I'm gonna put some orange, and we can try it. And now we have a tag on every component in the component tree here. And I'm gonna add a new a condition so that we can only show this tag on specific components. So let's say I have an option here that I'm gonna call meow true, and then I'm gonna apply the tag only on the components with this option. So here you can add a condition on the instance, component instance, and we can check if the component options have the smear. And now it's gonna display only on this one here. So now I can add it to more components like this. For example, I can add it to the root component. And after refreshing the page, I should see the tag appearing here. All right. Okay, so now what if we want to change the state of the plugin here? So let's say we have, for example, we have a counter, and then we want to update the state here. So let's say we have we are updating this counter every, let's say, 5 seconds. So we can say data counter plus equal 5. All right. And we want to display this information on our components. So we can add a new state here using instance data state.push in our inspect components hook here. So it could be time, and then we could use the counter value here, or maybe time counter. All right. Here we're gonna tell the devtools that we need to send a new update to the inspected component state. So I'm gonna say API notify components update. So that way, every 5 seconds, we're gonna tell devtools, hey, you need to fetch the component state again. So here we go, every 5 seconds. It's going up. Great. So this allows you to display reactive state and update the state inspector here automatically from your DevTools plugin. Okay, so going next to the custom inspector. So you can use this to create a new inspector under this menu here, under components. So you can put an icon on name, and then you can set tree information and set information to your custom inspector. So let's try to a very simple custom inspector. So to create a new custom inspector, we're gonna use the API dot add inspector function, and we can put some more information about this inspector. So we're gonna put an ID that we can store in a variable here. So inspector ID, use the my awesome plugin ID. And I'm gonna use it here. I'm gonna give it a name. And you can also use a material icon here. So for example, we could say we want to use the pets here. Pets icon looks great. All right. So if we save and we go back to the menu here, we can see that there's a new custom inspector below the components one here. And we can also see that the DevTools is showing us where this custom inspector is coming from. And if we go to this inspector, currently it's pretty empty. So we're gonna add some information about it. So we can use the get inspector tree hook to send the tree nodes to the DevTools. And as usual, it's gonna have 2 arguments with the payload and the context. And here we're gonna this hook is gonna be global for every DevTools plugin, so we have to put a condition first, checking if we are on the right application on the right custom inspector. So we're gonna check if the payload application is the same as the current application that we passed in the first argument here. And we are also gonna check if the payload inspector ID is the same as our custom inspector ID here. And then we can send information about this specific custom inspector. So we can do this using payload.root node equal, and then we can provide an array of nodes. So for example, we can have here the root node with a specific label. And then this node could have children, which are gonna be different. So for example, child 1 with a label. And then another one. Scroll a little bit. Oh, sorry, child 2. Okay, so now if I save, you can see that the tree got populated with the nodes we provided in this hook, and we can already select different elements So this can be useful if you want to display a tree, but you can also only display, root nodes. So that way you can display a list instead. It's going to look like a list. All right. So we can have both. And then you can, for example, put tags on everything you like. So for example, we can have a tag here, and it's going to be, for example, awesome with the text color. It's going to be, for example, white, and the background color is going to be black. Cool. So now we have to, send more information about the selected node. So we can use the a different hook for that, which is gonna be get inspector state, and this is gonna take care of sending data to the state inspector on the right here. So here we're gonna have the same condition as before, so that we only do something if this hook is called with our custom inspector on this specific application. Because bear in mind, we can have multiple applications on the same page. So we have to, check if the application is the same and it's the correct inspector. And then we can, do whatever we want. So for example, we could send a state only for the child one node here. So we can check if the node ID is equal to child one. And then we can send some state. So for example, we could have we could put a section here, so my section, and then we can put different properties. So for example, I can create a property cat with a value now. It's not editable. And then if we select the child1 node here, it's gonna send the corresponding state we've put here. All right. So we can say we have a different state depending on which child is it that we are inspecting. And we can, for example, change the state. And we can try again. So if I select child 1, it's going to be a cat, and child 2 is going to be a dog. It's going to be a dog. Okay. So great. So now we've created our own little, state custom inspector. We can also we can also use in the payload the filter method, to implement something related to search here. But that's basically up to you how you implement this. And I think we're done with the custom inspector. So finally, we can move on to the timeline. So what we can do with the API on the timeline is creating a new layer with name and a color, and push events on this layer, and maybe also group them if it makes sense. So let's switch to the timeline view here, and let's create a new layer. So to create a new layer, we can call the API add timeline layer function, and we're gonna pass it an ID. So we can create an ID in the variable here, just like we did with the inspector. Timeline layer ID is gonna be, for example, my awesome plugin. Can put a color. So let's use the same orange that we used before. We can give it a name. And then we can try it. All right. So here we can see that we have a new layer using the color we've set here in our DevTools plugin. And it's going to also display the plugin icon here to tell the user that that this layer is provided by my awesome plugin. And then we can, for example, let's say we want to send events here. We can use for any any logic. But for this example, I'm gonna say I want to send an event on the timeline when I click with the mouse on the page. So I'm gonna add an event listener. And I'm gonna use API.add timeline event to add a new event, and it's gonna be on the same layer. So that's why it's useful to create a variable. And I'm gonna put some information about the event. So for example, I could say the time is the current time, and the data is, let's say, for example, the mouse position was X on the mouse vertical position, right? And then we can try it. So now if I click on the page, we can see that my plugin is sending new events to the timeline, and I can select them and see more information about them here. So we can see that the data I've put here is used to display information about this event, so that you can use this API to display debugging information which is related to other events. So for example, we can clearly see here that this this event coming from my plugin is clearly related to the mouse event here. All right. So it will help the users of your plugin to debug their application over time. We can also provide a group ID. So for example, let's say we have a method doing something. So I'm gonna create a new okay, so I'm gonna create method for my plugin, which is gonna be do something. All right. And what I can do here, so I'm gonna say return a new promise, which is gonna be resolved, let's say 1 second later, to simulate that we are doing something on the server, for example. All right. So now we have access to this in our application. So I'm gonna go to this component and add another button, which is gonna call this method. Oh, sorry. So I called it do something. All right. And maybe you can add a little bit of logging here. So for example, console log done. And we can check if it's working. So after 1 second, we can see that the log is called here. But what could be nice is displaying this information on the timeline instead. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna return from the setup devtools function an object which is going to allow us to wrap this method with logic to display information on the timeline. So we're gonna create a variable which I'm gonna call devtools here, with the type being the return type of setup devtools. And if we set up the devtools, we can put the return of the function to this variable. The premise of this function. So for example, we could say that we have a track end function returned by devtools track start function with a label. So for example, do something to keep track of which method we are in. And we have to check if the devtools is defined, because in case that the devtools is not set up, we have to check if devtools is defined here. And then here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna call this track end function if it's defined. All right. So now we are going to implement those functions in our plugin, devtools plugin. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna create the object. So this is gonna be an object with the track start function. So we're gonna have a first argument with the label, and we're gonna return a function to end tracking, right? So we can put this function into this track end variable and call it when our operation is done. So what we're gonna do is we also need to have access to the API here. So what we can do is to store this API into a variable. So devtools API using type. I can use the type here. So it's gonna be devtools plugin API. We can put the API into this variable in the setup devtools plugin function. And now we have access to it in this track start function. So what we can do is to add an event. So for example, we could say add timeline event. I'm gonna use the same layer ID, and I'm gonna put an event here. So it's gonna be current time and with some data. So we can say, for example, the label. All right. And then we can return this devtools object from setup devtools. So I'm going to return it here. Okay. So now if I click on the button, we can see that I have the event here. We can, by the way, command this code so that we don't, get spammed with the click events here. So let's try it again. Okay. So we can see here that we have the do something label, which is nice. We can also put some title. So we could use the label of the title as the title of the event. So it's displayed in the list here. Do something. So then what we could do is to send another event when it's done. Okay. So let's use the same one. And let's say we want it to be done. All right. So let's try it. And we can see that 1 second after, there's another event with the done true property here. What could be interesting here is to be able to group those two events together because they represent a single operation going on. Okay, so now what we want to do is to create a group ID. So what I would recommend is to have some text. So for example, track, and then here we can put our ID number that we are going to increment so that we create different IDs every time. So that we create different IDs each time. And then we can use the group ID property on the event here to tell the DevTools those two events are meant to be grouped together. So let's try it. So when I click on the button, we can see that the display is different now because the DevTools draw a line around the two events, meaning they are in the same group. And if we select them, we have a new tab here, which is group, which is gonna display all the events belonging to this group. So let's try clicking multiple times on the button here. And we can see that since we are generating a different group ID for each operation, it's going to display different groups here. So we can clearly see that during 1 second, an operation is going on from our plugin. Then we can launch it multiple times. And we can see that we have different calls here. All right. So it's displayed nicely. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this live coding around the DevTools 6 API. And I hope it's gonna give you more ideas on how to integrate with the DevTools. So thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye bye.